Hey guys, it's Barrett with the Gimme Camper. So I have a very exciting project for you today. I was actually going to wait a little while to make this video, but I saw quite a bit of interest in Facebook, so I thought I'd go ahead and try to get it out for you guys. So are you looking for somewhere to store your RV sewer stuff, like your hose and your fittings and all that, and either you don't have a back bumper to put it in or it doesn't fit in there and you just kind of having issues with it? Well, I'm going to show you how to build, in my opinion, one of the best ways to store this so it's always with your camper. It's not in a tote somewhere. And basically we're going to make it out of just normal everyday building supplies, including some 5-inch vinyl posts, some end caps for those posts, some screws, some 4-inch rain gutter, and just a few other odds and ends. So we're going to get into that right after this. Alright guys, so before we begin, let's have some real talk here. So we're going to mount this underneath the camper. Now we went through and we replaced our entire suspension. We have lift blocks under our camper as well, and so we have quite a bit of clearance under the camper. That's the number one thing that you're going to want to keep in mind when you start thinking about this project. If there's any way that this can rub on the road while you're going down the road, you're probably not going to want to store your sewer stuff like this, because it's just going to be like tore off and laying on the side of the road. Just like the one that the factory or the dealership or somebody installed on the very back of my 29 RKS, which did not have the best suspension to start with anyway. But on like the first or second trip, that sucker just tore right off and it was laying in the road. I had to stop and go pick it up. It's a mess. Be very careful when you do this. If you do it as well, I would get it as close to the axles as possible, because that's going to increase your ground clearance. Like, your ground clearance might be fine sitting flat when it's on the front side of your camper, but when you go over a hill or something, that's going to decrease that ground clearance right there, because it's not at a fixed point like over the axles, where the axle is going to go up and down with the ground. I will say that there's many different options when you do this. My options may not be the best for everybody. Some people like to screw them to the frame. That's what I did. Some people like to use metal strapping because they feel like it's more secure. I feel like there's pluses and minuses to both of these. With some good fender washers and some self-tapping screws, I have personally found that the screw method works great for me, and that's what we've done. I'll keep an eye on it and I'll keep you posted if something happens with it. Now, I will say that I pretty much took my design from a video that Larry with Downsizing Makes Sense had, of one way that they did it. They actually compared like the store-bought one and made one themselves. And I used a lot of his design ideas, including the pin that I made to actually secure it in place. And that's a great video too. I'm going to post it down in the description. So if you want to check that out, then feel free to go over there and check his video out as well. I will say that you can buy these store-bought models. Some of the fittings may not fit in those as well, because they're not as big. It's going to be similar to at least using the bumper that's on the back of your camper if you have one. Now, that's a 4-inch square on the bumper, and I'm not sure the diameter of the tubing on the pre-built ones. And I have good friends down at Valterra, and I'm sure that they would have sent me one. Essentially, it would be the same one that was on my camper to start with. But truthfully, I saw a lot better form and function into making it myself. I can make it the dimensions I need, and I can kind of customize it a little bit, and we'll get into that in a minute too. I will say that it's probably not going to save you a lot of money to do the DIY route versus buying one, because this stuff's expensive. Like these fence posts, they're at least like $40 a piece right now. And so by the time you add all the stuff up, I don't know if you're going to save any money or not by doing it DIY, but I will say that I like the product better personally. Now, some people have looked at the design that I made and they said, well, if it wouldn't fit in the gutter, then it won't fit in that. Well, the gutters are usually 4-inch square, like I said, and this vinyl fence post is 5-inch square. And let me tell you, sometimes that 1 extra inch, that's all you need, okay? I mean, you know, that extra inch is all you need to fit your fittings and your accessories and all your sewer stuff in there. That's what I was talking about. Now, something else that varies other than using straps or screws on these is that a lot of people place the end caps on differently. I have one side that's fixed so it doesn't come off. I riveted those, and we'll go over that in a minute. Some people use screws. That's fine if you don't have a rivet gun. Now on the other side that's removable, that's where a little more variation usually comes in. I used a hitch pin, which I think is a great way to do it. I have also seen people use some springs or shock cord or something. That way it just kind of stretches when you pull it off, and you can push it down underneath and just let it hang there. You don't have to worry as much about like forgetting something that way, I guess. But I would worry that the spring would come loose, or whatever secured that would come off, or the shock cord would loosen after a while, and eventually it would cause a problem. Now, I think that also you would kind of pay attention to that, and you would see it before it became a big issue, but that's all, again, personal preference. So let's go over the supplies that we need for this project. Now, I did make 2 of these at the same time because I figured if I'm going to make 1, I'm going to make 2 because I want just extra storage there. Anywhere I can find extra storage that's unused and that's for a minimum amount of weight, I'm going to go for it, especially if it comes at a decently low cost. So I bought 2 5-inch vinyl fence posts from a big box store. I bought 4 5-inch vinyl fence post end caps. I needed 8 self-tapping screws that are number 12. Now the length of these screws is going to vary depending on your RV and application, and we'll get into that in just a minute. I also needed 8 fender washers that fit the self-tapping screws, and I wanted these to be as large as possible because that's what's going to kind of give you some extra holding force since we're just using the screws to hold the fence posts up. However, you also needed to keep in mind that the larger that fender washer is, the further towards the center of that post that's going to push the screw. I think the ones that I ended up using were about 1 1/4 inches. Could have been 1 inch. I did this a while ago, and so it's kind of not still fresh in my mind, but just keep that in mind. I also needed 2 10-foot sections of 4-inch U-style gutter and 4 end caps for that U-style gutter. I needed it could actually be a scrap piece of PVC 1x4. A lot of people use starboard. I actually just use this for a spacer. You just don't want to use something that rots. So for it to be readily available at like Home Depot, Menards, Lowe's, PVC board works just fine. I also used some 1/4 inch rivets. I actually bought a rivet gun down at Harbor Freight. It worked great for this job, and it came with the rivets. So far they're holding up great. Then you'll need approximately 2 feet of 3/8 inch rod, aluminum rod, and that's going to vary, you know, based on how you design and want to do that end cap. That's just for the hitch pin, and with that you'll also need some small cotter pins. And then just to bring all this together, you're going to need some black spray paint. All right, so now that we got the supplies, let's go over all the tools that we needed. So I used a cordless drill. I used a cordless impact driver. I used a miter saw. Now instead of a miter saw, mostly the saw is just to like cut the fence posts and stuff. You could use a hand saw if you don't have a miter saw. It's just going to give you a better cut with a miter saw. It's going to be more straight. You can also use a jigsaw. You can use about anything. It's just vinyl, so it's going to be real easy to cut. You also need some assorted drill bits as well as a hole saw. The hole saw actually comes in. You could use a larger drill bit, but it comes in to make the access holes that we'll talk about in a minute. You'll need a 6-inch driver extension because we're going to use those access holes like I talked about, and you're going to need a bit that's long enough to go all the way through the post to the other side for the screw. Then we used a vise. Larry over at Downsizing Makes Sense had a good point that if you don't have a vise because you're in your camper, he just used the pin box on his camper to bend this aluminum rod at 90 degrees, and I think that's great. You're also going to need something to cut that aluminum rod. What we used, because we had it available, was a grinder with a cutoff wheel. If you don't have that, you can use a jigsaw with a metal blade on it. You can use a hacksaw, anything to cut through some soft aluminum. And then we used a measuring tape. I think that was pretty much all the tools that we needed, except for like, you know, random little things like the nut drivers to put the screws in with the drill. All right, so now that we went over the supplies and we went over the tools, let's talk about the installation process and kind of planning that out. So the first step is to get those fence posts. They come 8 foot wide, which is going to be a little bit wider than most people are going to want them to be. So we're going to have to cut those down. So that's kind of an arbitrary number for you. I wanted mine to be as long as they could be. without sticking out of the sides. That way I could have the most storage space possible, because if you keep it like 6 inches or a foot inside of the edge of the camper, this is going to be harder to reach for one. It's going to have less storage capacity, and it's going to be more of a just pain in the butt to use. So what I did is I measured from the skirting, and then I took like 6 inches off. It was 4 to 6 inches, just to kind of make it almost come out right at the edge of the skirting. It's sunk in just a little bit. I can still, you know, fine tune that a little bit on the placement as far as where I access it on the installation part of it. But essentially, I went ahead and cut those down to kind of get that part out of the way, and I just used the miter saw for that, like I said. After this, I decided to go ahead and paint those posts black with the spray paint. I figured that that's going to be easier to do at this point rather than wait until they're installed. It's going to make it look more professional at least. Even if it gets scratched up, I can add some spray paint, but it's easier to get like that top part of the post and stuff with it on the ground before you put it in. So I just went ahead and spray painted it and waited till the next day to start the install process. Now when you're looking at your camper and you kind of test this out, one DIY trick for you is, like Larry also pointed out, to use something stack up under, like some totes or something under the camper, and that way that post can rest on that and it can be more into place of where you want it, and without having to like hold it up, and it's not as big of an issue. Essentially you're just using it to try to kind of clamp that up into place where it goes. Now I noticed as soon as I tried to do this that it was actually up about an inch, inch and a half past where the skirting came down. And so people can do a couple of different things here. You can make it shorter where you got to actually reach up under and open it, but that's going to be a pain. And I want a drawer, so I wanted a drawer to pull out of there, and that's going to block that drawer. It's not going to work. And so I decided to use some spacers. Like I say, some people use starboard, some people use other things. I used PVC. I'd actually never seen that used before, but I just went down to the Menards and bought a piece of 1x4 PVC. Now, truthfully, I only needed less than a foot, but I had to buy like a 6-foot piece. It also ended up taking 2 different widths of that board to get the proper space that I needed. Now, I just cut those off into like 3 or 4 inch blocks, and you know, it wasn't anything meticulous or anything like that. I just cut them off and thought that they would work fine, and they have. So now let's talk about actually mounting those fence posts to the frame. So this is probably the trickiest part of all this, is just to, you know, hold it up, drill it, get it screwed in, all of that at one time. And it's a little bit tricky, but it's not that hard to do. But how do you know where you need to put your pilot holes and stuff? So with my camper, I have an I-beam going down both sides. And so I just went to the very back, hoping that everything was installed squarely, and it, for the most part, looks like it was. And so I just measured, on the I-beam, I measured the vertical surfaces from the outside of one side to the outside of the other side. And so that way I knew like where the thickest part of that I-beam was going to be. And then it had, I think it was like 1.5 inches of the flap underneath that stuck out on both sides. And so what I did is I took that measurement of that horizontal piece of the I-beam that stuck out, divided that by 2, and that's the measurement I went with. And so I then transferred all these measurements over to the post, and I transferred the actual vertical part of the I-beam measurement first, and then I made a line after I centered that on the post. So I found the center point, and I took that measurement of the I-beam, divided it in half, and went from that to one side and then the other side, and that way it would be centered, because I wanted mine centered because it was pretty much from the skirting to the skirting. Now after I did that, then I took the measurement that we talked about for that horizontal piece of the flap of the bottom part of the I-beam, where I wanted the screw to be centered, and then I made a mark there. And now to make these marks, because I'd already painted it black, my wife actually had some chalk markers in the camper, and those worked really great. So I might raid her craft drawer again when I do something like this. So they made really good marks on top of the black spray paint. Couldn't ask for anything better, actually, and they didn't like rub right off, so they worked really good. So after I had those, I had 2 marks for length on each of the 4 posts. So then what I did is I took the fender washers that I had, and I just lined it up with the edge of the post. I inset it about 1/8 of an inch because that fender washer is going to hit the side wall of that fence post when it comes down. And so I wanted to have enough clearance for that, but I wanted those screws to be as far apart as they could, but still be set in enough where that the washer would go up without having any issues. So after I made that measurement and figured out what it was, I just drilled a pilot hole for the screw there, just a little larger than the screw. And then I transferred all those measurements just with a square really all the way around to the other side of the post. And when I went around to the other side of the post, I took a hole saw. I used a 1-inch hole saw, I believe, and I made a cut at that same point where those screw holes were on the other side. Now what this does, like I said, is it gives you an access hole, because when you're actually screwing this up into the camper, you can't get your drill into the fence post to screw it up. And so what you're actually going to do is you're going to hold the drill underneath the fence post down here. It's going to go through the access hole on the bottom, and that 6-inch extension bit's going to allow you to get to the screw up here and to screw that in. The other issue that I had was getting everything centered and getting that hole to go exactly where I wanted it to go. But what I ended up doing, and I kind of came up with a system as I went, is on one side of the hole, I actually put a screw in to hold those boards a little bit still because they were trying to spin whenever I was trying to drill them and put the screw in and stuff. And so I would put one screw in just to kind of hold that together, and that way I could hold it more with my other hand on the other side. And then I would hold that up, and I actually, before I held it up, so I drilled one hole right in the center of my space that I had available on that I-beam so that would center everything up, and that worked good. So I drilled that, and then I put the screw through the spacers in the fence post, and I just got the end of that screw and found the hole that I already pre-drilled, and then drilled that up in there. Now, at this point, you have one edge of that fence post kind of hanging there, right? So what I did is I went through and I tried to make it as square as possible. You just find some random point on the camper that's on both sides of the camper, measure from that so that everything's going to look square. And so I did that on the other side, just got it lined up pretty close to where I wanted it. And then I went ahead and the same side that I had the screw in, I took the screw that I had just in the spacers out, and I went back and drilled all the way up through the spacers and into the frame, into the I-beam, and then I was able to go ahead and put that other screw in. I did leave them a little bit loose at first and then go back and tighten everything up with just a ratchet at the end, because you don't want to take a chance on stripping anything out. Another good point is the drill bit that I used was also slightly smaller than the screw. That way it would have a good bite into the metal surface. And I would recommend pre-drilling the holes even though they're self-tapping screws, because that's some pretty hard steel that you're trying to get through right there. And it's decently thick. I mean, it's like 1/8 of an inch. And then after you get that up on one side, then you can go around and do the other end. Again, you're going to want to kind of make sure that it hadn't moved around at all and it's still square where you want it to be. And then my problem though that I had was that I had a propane line right there, which I just moved the spacers out a little bit, and that way it was kind of just going around the propane line, so the spacers do stick out a little bit past the I-beam there, which is not a big deal. The spacers still work. They're just used as spacers. You know, if you really want to get into it, you can move the propane line a little bit, but then you're going to have to, make some adapters and stuff for that. And I just thought it was a pain. And I didn't feel like it was necessary. So obviously don't drill a hole in your propane line. I feel like that should go without saying, but you never know these days. And so I just went ahead and drilled and attached the other end. And, I thought, oh, this project's about done, which has still got quite a bit of work to do, but that is probably the most technical aspect of the whole thing, is getting those fence posts up there. Now, another issue that I had when putting them up there was how far apart do you space these two fence posts out? I thought about like putting the fence posts where they're almost touching together, and then taking the end caps that I put on there and kind of trying to make them into one piece. That way they all come off at once, and I felt like that was going to be too challenging, and so I decided to leave like 6 inches in between the fence posts. That seems to work great. The pins come in from the outside and the cotter pins are on the inside, and that's not a real big issue at all. So that's what my spacing was, but again, you're going to have to kind of come up with something for your camper with your available space. The next step that I decided to do was put the fixed end caps on. That was actually, I decided to do that on the front side of my camper where my front door is, because the drain's on the driver's side of the camper, and so figure that's where you want to access the sewer hoses, over there on the driver's side, which is the back of the camper, because you're going to be pulling it out and just hooking it up to the sewer connection that's right there, right? I mean, that makes sense too. So what I ended up doing was using the rivet gun to put the end caps on the side over here on my front side. And I would say that that was a little bit difficult to get that big old rivet gun in there, especially on where I have the 2 fence posts on the inside aspects of each. I was able to kind of get it enough tilt there and still get the rivet to work. It probably would be easier if you put it on before you put the fence post up, but then you're going to have an issue where it's really easier if you can see through the end of that while you're trying to put that screw in, to give you some more visual reference. So I would wait until afterwards. It's not really a big deal at all. All right, so the next part is where we made the hitch pins. Basically, I mean, they're basically like hitch pins. I use 3/8 inch round aluminum. It's pretty soft metal, it's easy to work with. What I ended up doing was using a measurement, I believe it was 6 inches for the length of the pin, and then 2 inches for like the handle that I'm turning. So I cut these off in 8-inch increments. And like I said, I used a grinder and a cutoff wheel. You can use a hacksaw, you can use anything. But after I got these cut into 8-inch sections, I marked 2 inches away from the handle, and I just put it into a vise at that mark and used a hammer just to tap it over to bend the end of that aluminum. It's really soft, it's easy to do, so that's what I did. If you don't have it, like I said, Larry used his kingpin box to do it, because all you need is something to just hold it still while you just tap the end around, and that seems to work out pretty well. After this, I did use his idea as well to try to grind off one edge of the end of the pin, the end of the long pin, because what you're going to do is you're going to put the cotter pin in there, but you got to drill a hole for the cotter pin to go through. So you want it to be as centered as possible, and it's easier to start that drill bit if it's a little flat on one side. And so since I had the grinder, I put a grinding wheel and just made it a little bit flat there. He used a Dremel tool and a sanding drum. Anything will work, even a file. You don't really have to use anything, but it's easier to do because that drill bit's just going to kind of slip off the side if you don't have a flat surface. So after I got that in, I just tested out the cotter pins. They work fine. So then we went back over to the fence post. This was a little bit stressful for me because you're making a 3/8 inch hole, which really needs to be a little bit bigger, but you're making a 3/8 inch hole, and that flap on the side of that end cap's not that big. That, and you have to wonder about where that fence post end is in there, because you want to have some decent material on both sides of the hole on all of these components for it to have proper holding power. So I just kind of went with it because I was like, hopefully everything's going to work out. And it did. I probably overthought it too much. But I will say the 3/8 inch hole wasn't big enough. It's still probably not really big enough because it takes me a minute to get that pin in sometimes. But I just used the 3/8 inch drill bit and kind of reamed it out a little bit because I was kind of afraid to go to a bigger drill bit because of the reasons that I already talked about. All right, so then we wanted to make some drawers. Now, a lot of people say this is kind of overkill. Some people don't make the drawers. I find that they're really helpful because you can put some of those small accessories in the back that you don't use very much, and then you're able to access those pretty easily just by pulling it out. Now, if you just had hoses in there, you could connect the hoses together, and that way when you pull one out, it's going to bring the other one to the front. But I really like this drawer idea. So I got some 4-inch U-shaped gutter, and I cut that off. I measured the inside of the fence post, and I cut it off. I probably cut it off like a 1/2 inch shorter than the fence post Truthfully, you probably need to do like 2 or 3 inches. I didn't take into account, number one, the length that the end caps were going to stick out and stuff like that. So after I assembled this this drawer, which is all you do is you take the gutter, you cut it to the length, and you put the end caps on it. And I use the rivets for that as well. But that's the whole process there. It's pretty easy to do. So you take that and you push it up into the fence post. Well, whenever I did that, number one, it was a little bit tighter than I expected by the time you added the end caps and the rivets on the side of it. So it works fine, but you have to like twist it a little bit just to kind of make it a little less wide and then pull it, and that seems to work just fine. But it was also too long. So it was so long that I couldn't put the end cap on the fence post. So I had to drill out the rivets and then cut it off a little bit shorter and then put it all back together. Now that being said, it all works fine now. I'm really happy with this project. It was a little bit of a pain, but on a 1 to 10, I'd say it was like a 5. It wasn't horrible. I will say that, you know, after this, you got to go through and you got to get all your accessories and stuff. And I'm going to show you with the Rhino hose that I have kind of how it comes apart, because I never really knew about it, because I never needed to take it apart because I just kept it in a sewer hose, in a sewer tote before. But I had to actually watch a video for it. So if you have a Rhino hose, this is kind of how you have to take it apart to fit in there. I'm going to kind of insert that right here. Now after we got the hose in there, one side's basically just my main hose that's got the 90-degree elbow on it, and on the back end it's got the 12-inch clear adapter that I use, which I also have a video about. I'll try to remember to put that up here. But that adapter is great, especially if your sewer line is in the stock location, because it kind of gives you a little bit more reach back in there without having to get down on your knees and get up under there and connect all that stuff. But I brought mine out to the edge of the camper, which works a lot better. And then the other side, what I decided to do, I have like a couple of donut adapters there. I have an extra hose over there. And on the very back, I like to keep a water hose that's not for potable water. So the one that I had was only like 10 foot long, because I don't need a long one, but I like to keep one for some miscellaneous type things. And so what I ended up doing is I got one of those like expandable hoses that's kind of rubber and it stretches out. I got a 50-foot one, so that way, because I figured the 25-foot one's going to be really short before it expands. But I got a 50-foot one, and what I did is I just kind of laid it out lengthwise, and I just kind of went back and forth and just kind of curled it up a little bit and put some zip ties around it. That way it just fits right down inside of that gutter. And I always have an extra hose there, because that's the one part of my setup. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to carry an extra hose, because I don't want a potable hose and I don't want it to like be stored with my potable hoses. So that's what I ended up doing. It's working great. I like it. I've drove over 1,000 miles with this thing. It's not showed any signs of any issues yet. I will keep you guys posted on how it works. But thanks for being part of the family. Thanks for watching this video. If it brought you any help or information, please hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next week.
Do not forget to hit that subscribe button.